Servants had dignity in Israel. Israel's laws were concerned about regulating servitude rather than institutionalizing it. So you have, right after the giving of the Ten Commandments, you have how servants are to be treated, rather than being relegated to the very back of the law codes, as was the case in other ancient Near Eastern codes. You have the Mosaic law code that talks about the treatment and the dignity of the servant. As one scholar puts it, we have in the Bible for the first appeals in world literature to treat slaves as human beings for their own sake and not just in the interests of their masters.
Now, I'd like to address a general theme from Copan. Copan wants to pretend that in Israel the slave's life was just as valuable as the free person's life. Several times in the speech he refers to the dignity of the slaves. The inference is that this was drastically different from the way it was in the antebellum South. Now, this sounds really nice, and I wish it were true, but the fact is, it isn't. Not only could slaves be beaten and free persons not, but notice what Exodus 21:28 through 32 says. When an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall not be liable. But if the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has been warned but has not kept it in, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner also shall be put to death. If a ransom is imposed on him, then he shall give for the redemption of his life whatever is imposed on him. If it gores a man's son or daughter, he shall be dealt with according to this same rule. In contrast, look at what happens when the ox gores and kills a slave. If the ox gores a slave, male or female, the owner shall give to their master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. Notice that the death penalty may be required when a notorious ox kills a non-slave. Now, although the law seems to allow fines when extenuating circumstances are found, such a fine would have no maximum. In contrast to this, look at the penalty when a slave was gored to death. First, there appears to be no possibility of a death penalty. Additionally, the maximum fine was only 30 shekels of silver. Does this sound like the kind of law that values the lives of slaves and non-slaves equally? Of course not.
There's another portion that is typically raised with regard to, again, harsh-sounding scenarios in the treatment of servants. This is one of them, and it seems to be advocating that a wife and child could be left behind once the male servant is set free. This is Exodus 23. If you buy a Hebrew servant, again, this is if someone, again, it's a voluntary sort of thing, but you make this contractual arrangement. He is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year, he will go out free without paying anything. If he came in by himself, he'll go out by himself. If he had a wife when he came in, then his wife will go out with him. If his master gave him a wife, and she bore sons or daughters, the wife and the children will belong to her master, and he will go out by himself. But if the servant should declare, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master must bring him to the judges. He will bring him to the door of the doorposts, and his master will pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him forever, which we've already touched on. Now, in this case, a person might sell himself or even his wife or children to help them get out of debt. But again, it was a contractual arrangement for a certain amount of time, 7 years maximum. But here it seems that, well, aren't you practicing what the Civil War, the Civil War era slavery was all about, namely the separating of families from each other? It was a home-wrecking kind of scenario, and slave masters did this intentionally so that there couldn't be these attachments between the slaves and their families. But what we have here, some people also think it's maybe gender bias too, that the male gets the advantage, the female gets left behind. How is that fair? Well, we have to have good reason to think that this passage isn't gender specific. In fact, various scholars suggest that this alternate reading could be presented in kind of case law issues. If you buy a Hebrew servant, she is to serve you for 6 years. But in the 7th year, she will go out free. If her master gives her a husband, and they have sons or daughters, the husband and the children will belong to her master, and she will go out by herself. Secondly, this scenario isn't as harsh as it first appears. Let me just stick, for the sake of argument, with the male servant scenario. By taking the male servant into his home to work off the debt, the boss has made an investment, and he would stand to suffer loss if he simply let the servant walk out on the contract. In military service, if you have a contractual agreement, you don't say, hey, just got married, I'd like to be alleviated or relieved of my military duties. No, you've got to fulfill that contract. The same sort of thing here. The employer is going to suffer loss otherwise. So it doesn't make sense to let a man go with his family without paying off this debt. Thirdly, the released man has 3 options. He could wait for his wife and kids to finish their term of service while he worked elsewhere. Now remember, the wife and the kids weren't stuck in the employer's home for the rest of their lives. They had to be released when the wife worked off her debt, because she is also a fellow servant. But the now free man could work elsewhere, but this would mean he would be separated from his family, and the boss would no longer supply him with food, clothing, and shelter. On the other hand, if he lived with his family after the release, he would still have to pay for room and board. So this scenario created its own set of financial challenges. Also, another alternative, he could get a decent job elsewhere, save his shekels to pay his boss to release his wife and kids from contractual obligations. But the problem here is that it would have been very difficult for the man to support himself and to earn enough money for his family's debt release. A third alternative, one that we just read, is that he could commit himself to working permanently for his employer, a lifetime contract. And he could stay with his family and remain in a fairly stable economic circumstance, formalizing his intent in a legal ceremony before the judges, or God, as the text says, having his ear pierced with an awl. So those are a couple of scenarios in which we see servitude. When you look at it more closely, you realize it's not the kind of arrangement that a lot of critics say it is. It is not harsh, brutal, and severe, but rather it is something that really looks out for those who are in poverty in Israel, in light of the destitution that they're experiencing. These are people who are being cared for by the laws of Israel.
Copan attempts to apply Exodus 21, 2 through 6 equally for both men and women. However, this argument fails for several reasons. First, there are several slave laws which explicitly include both genders. Even in Exodus 21, there are 3. If the law in question were to apply equally to both, it would have said so. 2. Notice the difference in the term between male and female slaves. Verse 2 says that he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free. Now, if a man sells his daughter as a slave, notice what it says. She shall not go out as the male slaves do. It is obvious from this that her term was different from the male Hebrew slaves. Third, consider this. If female slaves were only to serve a maximum of 6 years, then why would the male slave have to commit his entire life if he wanted to be with his family? By Copan's claim, the woman would have less than 6 years left. If Copan is correct, wouldn't it make sense that he would only have to commit to the time left on her term? However, the law requires that he commit his entire life. Why? The reason is quite clear. Female slaves in the time of Exodus were slaves for life, and the children of her appear to also be slaves for life. This position appears to be quite certain. Now, by the time Deuteronomy was written, this would change. However, this would be several hundred years later. Throughout the speech, Copan tells us that Israel's slavery was better than the chattel slavery in the antebellum South. However, here is another example where it was worse. In the South, only non-citizens could be lifelong slaves, But in Israel, Hebrew females could be slaves for life, and there was a loophole that allowed an owner to coerce a Hebrew male to become a slave until the day he died.
There's one more text, and I'm just going to have to go very briefly on it because I want to get into the question of the Canaanites. And it's this, in Leviticus 25, 42 to 46. It seems that slaves from foreign nations could be kind of bought and sold in Israel. It says, as for your female and male slaves whom you may have, you may acquire male and female slaves from the pagan nations that are around you. Then, too, it is out of the sons of the sojourners who live as aliens among you that you may gain acquisition out of their families who are with you, whom they have produced in your land. They also may become your possession. Now, this is a text that troubles a lot of people, but as I said, the more closely we look at what is going on in this text and elsewhere in texts just preceding it, we start to see a different picture. According to Leviticus 19, just a few chapters earlier, Israel is told to love the stranger in the land. Also, Exodus's laws were to protect abuse of all persons in service, not just the Jews. In fact, the passage that I just talked about, the Hebrew servant in Exodus 21, that term Hebrew technically refers to not just someone who is a Jew, who is ethnically related to Abraham, but this term could be used of any person who did not have any sort of political allegiance or national ties, but was kind of an in-between in no man's land. This was the sort of person, the Habiru, the Hebrew. It had not yet been formed into the more technical understanding, of someone who is actually the offspring of Abraham. And so here, even in that text where you have this 7-year contractual agreement, it does seem to be speaking of a foreigner here, and what you have is permission, or basically a contractual obligation to let that person go after 7 years. So you have, even earlier on in the text, indications that those who serve as foreigners have a maximum cap of 7 years. But this seems to be talking about something that is more permanent. Those who have said, I love my master, and they continue to stay within the family generation after generation. Again, for those who don't have land, and foreigners who came to Israel could not have their own land, it belonged first and foremost to God, but the Israelites could have a part in that. But the land had to belong to the Israelites and not to foreigners. So they could either leave, or they could, again, one safe arrangement was to just live within the homes of their hosts in Israel. Also, the term acquire does not have to involve selling or purchasing persons as property. We see that, for example, Eve has acquired a man-child with the help of the Lord. Certainly not a matter of property. Or God is seen as the possessor of heaven and earth, the same word that's used in Genesis 14:19. Boaz acquired Ruth as a wife. It was a legal transaction, but certainly nowhere a matter of property by any means. Also, it's interesting. The term sojourners and aliens is used in this passage. But then it goes on to say in verse 47 that these aliens and sojourners, it says if they become persons of means, they are not to put Israelites into servitude. Notice this. Here these aliens and sojourners are ones who can work as servants within the households of Israel. But they can also work themselves out of their debt and become persons of means. So this is not at all intended to be something that is permanent, against their will, and so forth. Furthermore, we even read of cases where there are foreign servants who become elevated and apparently fully equal to Israelite citizens. In fact, one of Caleb's descendants we read about in 1 Chronicles 2, where it says, Now Sheshan had no sons, only daughters, and Sheshan had an Egyptian servant whose name was Yarha. Sheshan gave his daughter to Yarha, his servant, in marriage, and she bore him Attai. So here you have someone, a foreign servant, who is married to an established free person with quite a pedigree, Caleb's offspring. And the key implication here is that inheritance rights would fall to the servant's offspring, Attai. So there's a lot that is going on here that is very significant. And to simply write this off as, oh, a buying and selling of persons as chattel slaves, this is not at all what the text is saying.
When addressing Leviticus 25, Copan seems to understand that he has his work cut out for him. Therefore, we see him totally ignore the words in the passage and substitute it with something that just isn't there. First, Copan states that there was no difference between Hebrew and non-Hebrew slaves. He indicates that those who didn't have any political allegiance or national ties could technically be called Hebrews and be protected by the same laws. Now, does Copan offer any evidence for this? No, he doesn't, because there is none to offer. There is no passage in the Bible that ever uses the word Hebrew to identify anyone other than the line of Abraham. Like many apologists, Copan makes unsubstantiated assertions, hoping that his audience will simply accept them as fact. Instead of taking Copan's word, let's actually read the passage to determine if there is a difference between Hebrew and non-Hebrew slaves. You shall not rule over him ruthlessly. This is pointing back to verse 35, which identifies a Hebrew brother who has become poor. You shall not rule over him ruthlessly, but shall fear your God. As for your male and female slaves whom you may have, you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are around you. You may also buy from among the strangers who sojourn with you and their clans that are with you, who have been born in your land, and they may be your property. You may bequeath them to your sons after you to inherit as a possession forever. You may make slaves of them, but over your brothers, the people of Israel, you shall not rule one over another ruthlessly. First of all, notice that these non-Hebrew slaves were described as property. This is the Hebrew word akuzah. And what do you think it means? You guessed it. It means property or possession. Second, since these Hebrew slaves were property, notice that they are described as being lifelong slaves. They could even be willed to children. Notice that although Hebrew slaves were not to be treated ruthlessly, the same rule didn't apply to non-Hebrew slaves. According to Exodus 21, an owner of a Hebrew slave could beat him so severely that he could die after a day or two, and there would be no punishment given to the owner. Now, if that could be done to a Hebrew slave who was not to be treated ruthless, what do you think could be done to a non-Hebrew slave? This law in Leviticus is no better than what occurred in the pre-Civil War South. Next, Copan tries to show that since the slaves described in Leviticus 25:44 through 46 are identified as being slaves for life, they must have gone through the All ceremony. This is a reference to Exodus 21, where a male Hebrew slave could be coerced to become a slave for life. Copan is suggesting that the non-Hebrew slaves identified in this passage went through that ceremony. Now, how does he come to this conclusion? It's obvious. Copan wants to persuade his audience so badly that slavery in the Bible wasn't harsh that he is even willing to make things up. Copan also tries to argue that these slaves couldn't be slaves for life by referencing verse 47. He claims that these were non-Hebrew slaves who worked their way out of debt. How does he come to this conclusion? By assuming that the only way for an alien to become rich was by first being a slave. He points to Caleb's descendants in 1 Chronicles 2, who was a slave who was fortunate enough to be promoted to a higher status. Although this is true in this situation, Copan tries to make it seem like this was commonplace. But does that really make any sense? Think for a moment. How common could it be for a slave to become rich? Because this was so rare, it is very unlikely that verse 47 is referring to former slaves. Instead, it is likely referring to aliens who had businesses in Israel and had become wealthy as a result. As I stated before, The slaves in verses 44 through 46 are identified as slaves for life. Copan's attempt to defend slavery in the Bible fails on virtually every count. Not only does he take great liberties to read things into the text, he sometimes just makes things up. I am finding this tactic to be a very common tool of the apologist. Once again, I would like to point you to a resource that I relied heavily on. I have put a link to Tom Stark's book, Is God a Moral Compromiser, in the description box. The book is free of charge, and I encourage all of you to read it. Take care, and let me know what you think.